A bound service is a service that allows a client to bind to it. Once bound to, the service acts like a server in a client server relationship, accepting commands or information or messages, and is able to then respond to them and, in some cases, send information back to the calling client. A bound service can accept connections from multiple clients and will handle its life cycle by essentially executing when the first client binds, and then it will stop itself without a need to have stop self or stop service called when the last client disconnects. When a client wants to connect to a service, they will call bindService, which will then trigger the unbind callback of the service. This unbind returns an iBinder, which is essentially an interface that allows the client to speak to the service. There are a couple of ways that you can create or implement a service depending on how the service is going to be executed and how it will be used. So everywhere from a local service, one that will run inside of your application's main process and will only use a single thread, all the way up to multi-threaded inter-process communication, where you use something called the Android Interface Definition Language. So let's look at a simple implementation of a service, one that will run locally in our application process and that will allow us to bind to it. So here we have a very straightforward service called timer service. Timer service's current implementation is that it can be executed with a call to start service, which triggers the onStart command. And we simply call run timer, which creates an instance of timer thread and executes it. And when the last timer thread executes, it will call stop self, and that will close the service, or rather stop the service. What we're going to do is modify this version of our service to allow binding. And by doing so, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to allow our application to receive commands. Specifically, we're going to allow for pausing the countdown. And we also want to allow the countdown to be displayed not in the log, but rather within the activity. So we want a way to get feedback from the service. So to do any of that, what we will need to do is implement another class that implements the iBinder. To do that, you can simply create a subclass of the binder class, which has already implemented the iBinder interface. And a binder is simply going to be, for us, a series of functions that we will use to interact with the functions defined inside the service. And you can essentially create and present any interface you would like. So we will make this an inner class so that it will have access to the functions defined inside the service. And then we can simply present our functionality. For example, we can have a function called start timer, and start timer will simply call run timer. But in this instance, we are no longer looking to have it stop with a start ID, it will simply run to completion, since there would be no requirement that we start the service. Therefore, there would not be a run, a start ID for us to pass to stop self. So what we'll need to do is modify our logic just a little. So again, this is going to ignore the fact that we had this start service feature. Still allowing. So I'm just removing all the start ID references. And now start timer, we'll just call run timer. So when you call start timer on the binder, it will call run timer in the service. Similarly, I want to have a function called pause timer. Now, to do pausing, we're going to keep this very simple, too simple in fact. And we're going to, just for demonstrative purposes, we're going to implement what's called a spin lock. And a spin lock is simply a while loop that keeps the thread on this statement until such time that it breaks. So it's a quasi-infinite loop. And I say quasi-infinite in that we have the ability to modify its conditional variable. Obviously, a spin lock is not something you would actually use in real life. There are ways to yield a thread, and then you can interrupt a thread. You can do a lot of different things. This is just, again, a quick and dirty way of demonstrating sending commands to our service using a binder. So pause timer will essentially have the ability to pause and unpause. So is paused is equal to not is paused. So that will just essentially be a toggle for us. And unbind, which is the callback that gets invoked whenever we bind to the service, will simply return an instance of timer binder. That's it. Now, every time a client or activity in this case binds to our service, it will receive an instance of timer binder, which has these functions exposed. And by calling them, we can essentially impact our service in some way. So let's look at getting this feature up and running first. So we're going to hop over to our activity, and we're going to have a few more pieces of information that we need to define. So we're going to make a call to start, instead of to start service, to bind service. And bind service, instead of one argument, will take 3. So the first argument is, as we have here, the intent. The second argument is going to be what's called a service connection object. A service connection object is a callback that gets invoked whenever we have connected to or disconnected from a service. Essentially, our call to bind service is asynchronous. Our application continues to execute past this call while the connection is established. And as such, we need a callback to be informed when the connection has been established And it's in that callback that we will be presented with our binder instance that will allow us to speak to the service. So I'm going to define a service connection object. And I will add the two functions, onService connected and onService disconnected, that will be invoked at different times depending on when we have either connected to the service or lost our connection to the service. OnService connected will receive two arguments: the component name of the service we've connected to, as well as the binder that service returned via its implementation of onBind. OnService disconnected, as mentioned, gets invoked whenever you've disconnected from the service, and OnService disconnected only receives the component name from which you have disconnected. So our goal here is to do a couple of things. The first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that our binder that we're going to receive, we want to store a reference for timerService.timerBinder. And then we will store that object that is passed into us under that reference. So service is again the iBinder that we defined. So we can cast this as timerService.timerBinder. So that cast allows us to essentially store the reference. Now, it's very dangerous. With this, our goal is to use this timerBinder to send information to the service. But it's very dangerous to try to use the binder if, for whatever reason, we've lost connection to the service. As such, it's good to sort of keep a flag as an indicator of whether you're connected to the service or not. Again, this is just the simplest way. Another way to do it could be to have this timerBinder be nullable, and then we could check for null, but let's at least separate those concepts in the beginning. So we will have a Boolean that will be initialized to true whenever we establish a connection to the service, and will be set to false whenever we are no longer connected. That defines my service connection object, and I will now pass that service connection object to my call to bindService. The third and last argument that we need to provide is essentially a flag that tells Android how to treat the service when we are connected to it. And this ranges from ensuring that the service is recreated if it is stopped, giving the service the same priority as our foreground, as our activity, or not giving it the activity's priority. It essentially different ways. The standard use case is to simply pass in bind auto create, unless you have a special need to pass in a different argument. So this basically says if the service is lost, create another instance for us and rebind, essentially. Well, in this instance, we've actually put our bind call inside of our onClick listener, which is not something we want. It was perfectly fine to put our start service call under our buttons, our start buttons, onClick listener, because that's essentially what we wanted. We wanted to start the service whenever we hit the button. But in this instance, we don't want to bind at the time we click this button. because the idea is clicking that button is going to start the timer. But binding for us no longer starts the timer. Binding just gives us a iBinder object, this timer binder that we've defined, and it's then a call on timer binder that will start the timer for us. So what we actually need to do is to connect prior to any attempt to make a call to the service. So we're doing that outside, or rather we're doing inside of our onCreate. So every time our activity is created, we will bind to the service. And then because I am binding here, the idea should be that at some point I unbind. And if I'm binding in my onCreate, then that unbind should be done in my onDestroy. So I simply call onbindService, and it needs me to pass in the same service connection object that I defined. But that service connection object, I defined it here as a local property, or as a local variable, a local value of my onCreate, which means that there is no access to it here. So I need to move this definition from onCreate and define it at the class level. So nothing else has changed. All that's changed is the scope. So now this service connection object can be accessed, and I can pass in my service connection object here. So whenever my service, whenever my activity is destroyed, it will disconnect from the service. Again, this can prevent memory leaks, etc. So now that I've bound to the service in my onCreate, I can now essentially start communicating with the service, but I would ensure that I only do that if I'm connected to the service. So if I'm connected, then I want to start the timer. And we can actually see how that works. So hitting start, there's my timer running pretty much the same as we were running before. So my goal at this point is to now allow additional information to be sent to the service. So I could add a pause button if we wanted to make this very simple. And now that we have two buttons, it makes sense for these buttons to have unique names, or more descriptive names. So our pause button will pause or unpause the service. So our goal here is to then simply find view by ID. And then if we're connected, pause timer. Or a better name for this would probably have been toggle pause. So now we can run our updated code, and the inefficiency of the wait lock aside, we'll see that we can start the timer, and now we can pause a timer and unpause it. So I'm able to send additional information to the service via the binder. Now, the last thing we want to do is we want to update our text view with the countdown values rather than looking at it in the log, which is only good for us, the programmer. But if this timer application needs to be seen, used by someone who's not the coder, then we need to actually see it in our UI. So we need a way to get information from the service back to the activity in an asynchronous way. As you can imagine, we're not in a situation where we can simply give a response to a function call. Certainly in the binder, if it's something that we can simply calculate and return, then we could just give our function a return type. And that's sort of an implicit way of giving feedback to our service. But if we want to be informed of something like progress or get any sort of asynchronous feedback or information from the service, then we need another method of doing this. Now, the documentation lays out a few ways that this can be done, essentially by referencing something called a messenger object. We're going to look at a very simple version here, and we can get away with this simple version simply because this is a local service. What we're going to do is we are going to utilize something that is generally used for inter-thread communication. We're going to use a handler object. So we're going to have our application be provided with a handler, the same handler that we use to do inter-thread communication. This handler will then be initialized by the activity. The idea here is that we define a handler with its callback inside the activity, and we pass a reference to the service. With this reference, the service will be able to send messages to the activity, which will trigger that callback and allow us to process information inside the activity. So using this handler, we can essentially send information back and just verifying that the handler has been set. We would do something similar. If the handler was nullable, we would just check to make sure that it actually did in fact have a handler object provided. So in this case, since it's just a simple integer value, we can send an empty message of I. So as long as we have a handler, we'll send a message to whomever provided us with the handler. In this case, it was sent by, we're going to send it from the activity. So our activity will define a handler. So this handler can be passed to the service, and because we want to make sure that this handler is always available to the service whenever we're connected, we'll simply make that the very first call that occurs whenever our service connections on service connected callback is invoked. That will be the first thing that happens when our activity connects to the service. So as soon as that happens, I'll take the binder and I will call set handler, and I will pass in timer handler. So at all times, the service will have access to a handler as long as we're connected to it. Now, the goal of my handler here is to update the UI of the activity. So I'm going to need a reference to that text view. That I will initialize in my onCreate. And then I can update my timer text view using the what value, since I'm sending an empty message from the service. And if everything goes according to plan, when we start our service, we now get messages coming to us. And this is a far improved way. Instead of sending messages via something like a broadcast, which unfortunately has the ability to be interpreted or intercepted rather by any component that is listening for that specific broadcast, therefore it facilitates information leakage. This version essentially ensures that only the component that provided the handler can receive messages. So it's direct, it's less noisy, and invariably more secure. So I hope this example sufficiently demonstrated how you can A, bind to a service and facilitate communication with that service, even asynchronous responses from the service to a client component, such as an activity.